My position is pretty clear. I don't have an elaborate ending. We are Americans because, one, we live in America. It is our political home. Secondly, we speak American English and have lost the languages that we spoke prior to arriving here. There are several different things that I could address in that last attempt at a response. But I'm going to read something a little later, but I'm going to read something now from Dr. Shekan Diop. In April 4th of 1985, he came to Morehouse College. And when he was there, you could find this work in Great African Thinkers by edited by Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. And in this, on page 320, the year 1986, it says, this is Shekan Diop speaking, we must reconstruct a new Afro-American cultural personality within the framework of our respective nations. Our history from the beginning of mankind, rediscovered and relived as such, will be the foundation of this new personality. And if anybody has read the work, knows that I don't argue that everything was taken away from us. And if we were to believe Kamau, he would make it seem like this is what he calls a common sense argument, and which I would have to disagree. This is an argument based on years of research and reading many scholars, in which we do not have time to address here on this issue of culture, black, white, Asian, Native American, or whatnot. And I quote a little bit of everybody in the Bakala of North America. And again, we have fundamental flaws in his argument. He tries to use the Malcolm X cat born in the oven, argument, and that's essentially the problematic which I addressed at the beginning of the discussion. It's one based on biology, which we can undeniably, by way of genetics and paleoanthropology, say that everybody is an African. If we go by his logic, there is no distinction. He already could not distinguish, based upon his logic, the difference between an African and a Native American. Now, when we come to this issue of time, we have this issue of, for instance, you have like the Arabs, who have been in North Africa and Africa for more than 2,000 years. At what point did they become African? We have Europeans who have been in Africa for about 500 years. And more than that, actually, if we go, because they've been in there since pharaonic times. We have the records, of course, of ancient Egypt, of Europeans being in Egypt since 1500 BCE. We have the issue of the Africans themselves. Now, what I'm trying to bring out is the necessary contradiction in trying to reduce everything to the African continent. Because if we talk about the Australian Aborigines, who are definitely black, can you say that they're African if they've been there for 30, 40,000 years and not migrating back into Africa? These are the kinds of questions that people need to really think about. If there is no political system, he tries to skate around the fact that it was not called Africa. Africans didn't call the continent. I'm not even sure if they understood the boundaries of the continent in full in that way to name the whole continent. That is a European concept, to go around naming continents and naming whole people. You don't find that in African traditional systems. You won't find any record of that. Only when Europeans come in and name all Africa Ethiopia. The Arabs come over here naming it, Sudan. Then, of course, America is naming it Negro land. Of course, the Romans doing it with Africa after a small Berber people named the Afri. And the Arabs coming in saying Afrika. This is where the term comes from. But no one knows what the meaning is. There was no unified African state, no unified African language, nothing in existence for one to say conclusively that there was an African in the correct cultural terms, in which I cited, exclusively these particular scholars, in which, of course, he has not read all the material. I would assume has not contemplated it. But I'm going to end on Dr. Nobles again, because this is how you have to wait. It's not enough to just throw terms out there. You have to weigh them against definitions and concepts. So we're going to continue to quote Dr. Nobles. And I already cited the actual particular source of this, but this is slide number 25. So I'm going to be reading slide 25 and 26 on my slideshow. The system of culture teaches the people to recognize phenomena and to respect certain logical relations amongst phenomena. Culture gives meaning to reality. As such, culture has the power to compel behavior and the capacity to reinforce ideas and beliefs about human functioning, including issues of educational achievement and motivation. As such, culture is the invisible medium in which all human functioning occurs. It is important to note, in fact, that nothing human happens outside of culture. To think of culture as the medium in the petri dish is an appropriate analogy. It is the stuff in which human development occurs. Going to the next slide. Culture is to humans as water is to fish. It is our total environment as such. Education as well as curriculum development are cultural phenomena. Culture is therefore the invisible dimension of all curricula. Hence, just as the nature of the water, salts versus fresh versus polluted water, influences the reality, the survivability of particular types of fish, so too do different cultural systems influence the reality of particular groups of people. In fact, all of our training and education are bound by what we call customs of professional convention, which are nothing more than cultural traits or rituals. Culture is like our water, and like the fish out of water, some humans can be out of their culture and thereby act inappropriately or fail to thrive. In a similar analogy, culture is like the electricity that illuminates the light bulb. We can only know or understand the electricity by what it does. Accordingly, if we are going to have a practice of education that's appropriate for African American children, then it should be clear that we need to understand the electricity that's going to guide the practice. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here, but I like that water analogy. Because if you take something out of its natural environment and put it in another, it affects them to the point where it can either make them thrive or pollute them and kill them. Now, all of these books and stuff in which I mentioned earlier, they would not exist. There would be no reason for breaking down the psychological aspects of mental slavery, a blueprint for black power and all of these other different works, if there was no environment change, no cultural change. We were not taken out of our African waters and brought over here into these American waters, using the analogy of water or the seas or whatnot being culture. And regardless of how he likes to word it, everything that these authors are writing are supporting my point. Now, when we talk to these African authors, they all boil down to language. And notice what I've done here. When I quote the African authors, they all boil it down to language. When we talk about the African American authors, they don't deal with language because most of them aren't linguists, And this is very important because if you can't articulate the world in your own language, you can't argue that you are essentially your culture. And because you have no culture, culture boils down to language. That's the difference between Native American cultures and African cultures. Native Americans have feathers, we have feathers. Of course, they had, the teepees and the circular shapes. We had the huts and the circular shapes. They honor ancestors. They pour libations. They recognize the earth as symbols. They have a priesthood. They respect their elders. They have initiation rites. There's nothing that separates them other than a few quote-unquote genetic haplotype markers, which is insignificant in the final analysis of genetics, and their language. So until you're ready to deal with the language piece and not skip around it and skate around it, then you're not prepared to really have this full discussion. And that's what I end on.